So, the title of today's talk is Defining the Narrative, Media and Politics in the Middle East, right? So, I'm here today to tell you about the narrative. Capital T, capital N. The true narrative, right? The one and only narrative. How do you feel about that? Does anyone buy it? I don't think so, right? I mean, living at the intersection of politics and media, if it teaches you only one thing, then it teaches you that there are always narratives and counter-narratives, right? That's why today I'm not going to talk about the narrative. I'm going to talk about the meta-narrative, the narrative about the narrative. How do we understand it? How do we perceive it? How do we unpack it, right? How do you understand the dynamics of how a narrative is constructed? How do we deconstruct it? This is not to say that facts don't have a place in as they say, a post-truth era. As a matter of fact, facts are much needed today more than ever, right? But there has been always multiple versions of the truth. That's why we have different religions. That's why we have different interpretations and ideologies. Even if we're reading from the same text, same page, same line, we will always have different interpretations, right? But I also believe that it's very important for us to agree on maybe methodologies, maybe to verify some of the basic facts. For example, did Professor Davis say this or not? This should not be debated, right? Whether she said it or not. How we perceive it can be contested. How we interpret it can be questioned. But whether she said it or not, you know, then we enter into a very nihilistic world where, you know, everything is just equal to everything, right? This is to an extent is becoming the virtual world, right? Sometimes you cannot even verify whether something was actually said, whether something has happened or not, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, before I contextualize all of that, because the promise is to talk about the Middle East, before I do that, I think it's worth starting with somewhat a theoretical basis. When we talk about politics and media, it's impossible to dismiss a very central concept, that is the public sphere. And just like it is impossible not to talk about the public sphere when you talk about media and politics, it is impossible not to talk about Jürgen Habermas when you talk about the public sphere, right? So Habermas did the exercise of tracing back the concept of the public sphere, and we're going to discuss what the public sphere is altogether. He traced this back, at least in the history of Europe, into 16th, 17th century France with the bourgeois class. His main argument was the following, is that, you know, the formation of the bourgeois class, literary salons, and so on and so forth, knowledge, authority, was challenged. And there was that class, and you had philosophers and poets and discussing what the public good is, kind of contesting and challenging the authority of the palace, and so on and so forth. This created a space for everyone to engage in a meaningful way to discuss public issues, right? But then another element came into the equation, that is the element of technology, right? We moved from literary salons to print, and suddenly print became cheaper, right? And we had more publications, and I was talking to Professor Davis about the what's called the Arab Nahla. As Arabists, I think you're all familiar with that. So during that period, but and in the context of the Middle East, but elsewhere as well, newspapers became more and more popular, and it was interesting to see, and we also delved into this, it was interesting to see an Arabic teacher making a commentary in the newspaper about Darwinism. Right? And you would think, what knowledge does he have about Darwinism or biology or whatever? But this is what print brought into the equation, is that more people are allowed to discuss topics that were at one point more elitist in a way. And then we moved towards the 20th century to audio and picture, radio, TV, etc. And the base of people who produced and consumed knowledge expanded. So even illiterate people were able at least to be at the receiving end through radio, picture, and so on and so forth. So the idea of this public debate about the public good took a different momentum until we reached the social media. Of course, Habermas made many assumptions, one of which is that this public sphere was essentially a rational one, that rational actors would be able to engage equally about certain topics, and that public sphere would eventually become free of pre-modern notions such as tribalism, religion, and so on and so forth. To his surprise, 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran happened, and then of course we started talking about the resurgence of religion, not only in Muslim majority countries, but Latin America and elsewhere. In addition to this and that, he came to realize that even satellite channels were actually controlled by businessmen or governments. And he revisited his thesis and said, you know what, that assumption about a rational public sphere that is free of interest, free of pre-modern notions, cannot exist simply because those mediums, if you wish, were controlled by transnational corporations, businessmen, governments, etc. But then, I mean, he passed away a few years ago. He didn't have the chance to comment on social media. And social media is a totally different term for a number of reasons. One of which is fragmentation of authority and power. And we no longer talk about one public sphere, we talk about multiple public spheres. As a matter of fact, even the platforms themselves sometimes dictate the way we interact. So you have Snapchat, but then you have Twitter, and then you have Facebook, and one is more popular in one country, and so on and so forth. And these communities don't necessarily talk to each other. I mean, you would find something that's trending on Twitter, completely dismissed on Instagram, and so on and so forth. So it's created a very different dynamic there. Some of the questions, some of the dilemmas of media technology in the public sphere, does the medium dictate the discourse? That's a question. Sometimes the medium is the message they say, right? Can neutrality exist in media? Oftentimes in our region, we get comments like, you don't have free media, neutral media. Fair enough, but the question is who does, right? So, how do you compare freedom of expression today compared to the past? Question to the audience. Would you say that you today have more freedom of expression compared to your grandparents? Anyone wants to take a chance?
Of course.
Please.
Yes, I think there is more freedom. The cost of technology made it easier for us.
Yeah.
And also in the age of globalization.
Yes.
But also I think there is some neutrality can exist in the media.
Okay. So our colleague there, did everyone hear him? So he said, yes, we have more freedom of expression, and there is some sort of neutrality thanks to technology. To an extent, yes. I'll just kind of try to problematize this, question it, right? I mean, when you form your opinion, you form it based on information, right? How do you get your information?
Asking me?
Yes.
Reuters. Associate Press, I think, if I want to do it myself, but if I want to go bias, I would go Arabiya, Jazeera. I will take here Muslim Brotherhood, here Radical Jihadists. Not for my own. If I want to contain Iran, I'll go with Arabiya. If I want to go with Muslim Brotherhood support, I'll go with Jazeera, and so on.
Exactly. So what we have today, I mean, the limitations of freedom of expression is not about the lack of an oppressive power only. It's also about access to information, right? So the limitations of access to information were very different in the past from today. So in the past, it was very difficult to get the information. Today, we have excessive access to information to the extent that no one person, no one machine, no one institution, I mean, can comprehend all of that. And this becomes your limitation to the kind of information that you can process to form your supposedly free opinion, right? So once again, I mean, it creates different dimensions, but then it creates other limitations. And there is no, honestly, easy answer or right answer to this question. Who produces knowledge? See, at one point it was a very elitist trade. Today, literally every single person who owns a device, anyone who doesn't own a device here, whether it's a laptop or social media, no one. Oh, you don't? No laptop? No phone? No Twitter? I salute you. That's an exception, I would say. But the thing is, all of us can be producers of knowledge, right? We're no longer at the receiving end. And this, of course, challenges the authority, whatever authority, of course, political, religious, tribal, societal, you name it. But then it creates many other sets of challenges. Because, I mean, what's the criteria here, right? I mean, who verifies, who does the fact-checking, etc. I mean, if you want to publish a peer-reviewed journal, then you go through a process. But the process to produce knowledge for public consumption is literally typing, a few buttons, like pressing a few buttons. So once again, this is part of the challenge that we have today when it comes to knowledge production. And you would think that it's an easy thing. You go to the credible sources. Believe me, most of us, most of the time, receive information without verifying. It happens to all of us. And revolutions from cassette to Twitter, if you remember, 1997, I mean the 70s, Khomeini in France was recording these, recordings, and those cassettes would be smuggled to Iran, and the revolution happened. Suharto in the 90s, sometimes they call it the hotmail revolutions, university students sending emails, talking about, certain rights, the need to protest, etc. And once again, that happened in the Arab Spring. Likewise, it was mainly Facebook. And just to avoid being a Qatari, just to avoid any controversies here, no pictures, just the GCC, right? So the GCC Crisis, Twitter, it's really the Twitter crisis. And if anyone is working on a thesis, or I highly encourage you to pick any of these topics and talk about the role of Twitter, let's say in the GCC crisis, or Facebook in the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. A case study, this is where I contextualize all of that and talk about the Middle East. So media, politics, and the Arab Spring. For a moment, yes. Just forget about the consequences of the Arab uprisings. Just remember the first 12 to 18 months of these uprisings. That was the period. Remember, everyone was celebrating, right? Here in the US, in the UK, elsewhere, these youth were inspiring everyone. Once again, forget about the consequences. We're talking about only the first 12, 18 months. With that in mind, let us discuss some of these dynamics. Media, politics, and the public sphere. So one of the main questions that I wanted to look at is, was an inclusive public sphere possible in the Arab region? During that period, was it possible? As you can see, this is a lady with a niqab, hand in hand with an arm, wearing her cross. Here you can see a priest and a sheikh, once again chanting for the same thing, same objectives, etc. That was the spirit at the time. And remember, that's the question. An inclusive public sphere, the possibility of achieving that. What I call the could have been public sphere. The result, and I'm quoting, the result of advances in communication and transportation has been challenges to authoritarianism, the fragmentation of religious and political authority, and increasingly open discussions of issues related to common good. That is Armando, Salvatore, and Ekelman. I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Ekelman like a couple of years ago, and we discussed that. They published this just before the social media revolution. And I urged him to kind of update this thesis and maybe leave it. So while the state preserved its monopoly over coercion in the name of the public good, other societal actors have claimed equal rights to self-representation through rational reasoning of what this public good actually means and how it is to be realized. So one of the things that happened during the uprisings, and maybe as a result of the social media, etc., is that the monopoly of governments over the public sphere was broken. This is not to say that they had no influence or no ability to manipulate something, but the monopoly was over, and other actors started claiming the right to either represent themselves or their communities or represent others. So, the could have been public sphere, at least in this context, is this equally accessible space in which universal public reasoning about the common good of the nation is taking place, is arguably the could have been public sphere. How is this public sphere new? I mean, one could argue that we've seen this before, right? It's new in 3 different ways. The scale of the public participation, that was unprecedented. And that was not elitists, that was everyone, both genders, all religions, regardless of the social status of the people who were participating. And then, the political and moral authority of public participation. For the first time, the people felt that their vote mattered. Before that, I mean, they thought that, okay, they would go vote, nothing changes, why, bother in the first place, right? And this is where, by the way, some other societies are right now. But at that moment, people felt that whatever they said really mattered. So that's the second way of how this was different. And then the third thing is the merge of previously isolated spheres into a universal sphere. So I know, Professor, that you're interested in narratives and narratology, etc. So one of the excellent narratologists in Arabic studies is Said Yaqin, a Moroccan professor. So one time he wrote this article about Islamists and Islamist movements prior to the Arab uprisings. Let me remind everyone, in Tunisia, when the revolution happened, everyone was taken by surprise. Oh my God, in Tunisia we have Salafis? And a significant percentage of Salafis, right? As if these mushroomed overnight. Of course, we know that this is not real, right? I mean, those were always there. It's just there was this public sphere that decided not to see them. It was a very elitist one. It was mainly government. It was mainly urban cities that they decided to push everyone else to the margins, including these people. And of course, in his case, I mean, Sayyid Yaqin talks about even the literature. I mean, someone who's an Islamist who produces a poem you would classify it immediately as al-adab al-Islami. Though the topic sometimes is about love or whatever, but you would still classify it as such just because the person who produced that is, you know, an Islamist, right? And this was a way to kind of isolate the different spheres in a way. So what happened in the Arab uprisings is this picture. Let me go back. Is this. Suddenly, the society discovered, you know, its different nuances and different parts. And that was the main, or the third characteristic of this new public sphere, or at the time newly emerging public sphere. The new conditions resulted in new dynamics, different actors engaged willingly, equally, rationally, and in the political process and public debate in accordance to terms generated outside their own worldview, and we'll talk about that. Example, Islamists had to enter a public reasoning process, subjecting their own religious premises to be negotiated within a national framework. An example, in the presidential elections in Egypt 2012, many of the presidential candidates were Islamists, not only Morsi but others. So one of these, who was a Salafi, interestingly enough, when asked about you know, his views about women wearing certain dress code in beaches, etc., you know what his answer was? I mean, you would expect that his answer would be, you know what, the Quran says this, and the Prophet says that, and hence the result is, you know, A, B, C. No, that was not his argument. His argument was the following. You know what, we live in a different era. Let's ask the people. Let's ask them. If the majority of the people think that it's okay to wear, I don't know, bikini, or fair enough. But if the majority says no, then that's a different matter. Let's analyze this. What's happening there? Let's forget the details of the examples and analyze the logic there. The logic is the following. There is a person who moved from a religious reasoning process into quote-unquote a secular one. This is essentially a secular argument. You know, those who study Islamic studies, you know the concept of al-Hakimiyya, right? And it's very central, right? The sovereignty of God, right? Hakimiyya lillah. What he was essentially saying is that the sovereignty is for the people, Hakimiyya lil-nas. Whether we like it, this is effectively what he was saying. This is a shift in the logic of how people were reasoning that was completely overlooked. Completely. So some of the overlooked implications in the midst of the ideological and political, I'll try to conclude in a minute, mediating differences. Right? The most important yet underestimated gain of genuine revolution and the others was the unprecedented universal consensus on the mechanisms of mediating differences. They, you know, maintained their differences, but they agreed on one thing. How do we mediate and negotiate our differences? Through elections, through universal suffrage, through voting, through debating in talk shows, journalism, etc. There was a consensus over the mechanism. And this is really what matters. Because we will never eradicate the differences. Give me a single society, with the exception of fascism, of course, that eradicated differences. There's none. And the other thing is private justification, public reasoning. I'll leave this. I feel like I've taken a long time. If you have any question about that, because the question here, I mean, remember the example of the dress code in the beach? Many people would say, okay, this is hypocrisy because they say something publicly, but then privately they talk about another thing. We can analyze this, and I'm more than happy to address it in the Q&A. That's another example. Can this public sphere be reproduced? Who controls the media? This needs to be asked. be creating the institutional and political equilibrium that existed just post the Arab uprisings. All of that might help us, reproduce that moment. And thank you so much.
My name is Mohammed Khatib, and my question about I'm interested in information warfare, where it's media, it's a form of media. And I was hoping that you would address information warfare players in the Middle East, whether it's in the US campaign in Iraq, whether it's Israel with the Hezbollah, or Saudi or Qatar or whatever. But why aren't we addressing these play? Do they play important role in Middle East politics? And why aren't we addressing it?
Go ahead. Sure. No, this is absolutely a very valid question, and this is one of the questions to me. And that's why we've been talking a lot about the need of some sort of virtual governance. We keep talking about good governance in politics, but we really need virtual governance. You will be surprised that we don't have obligatory rules, laws, regulations to this virtual world. Despite its huge impact, despite the kind of crimes that might be committed and the damage that this can cause, but that's why we really need to, I totally agree. I believe there will be a number of conferences coming, very, very soon, including a conference in Qatar exactly about that. So this is definitely a topic to be addressed. I would put it in its wider context, that is cyber governance. I'm not sure if this addresses your question, but I'm more than happy to elaborate depending on.
Hi, my name is Lolwah Al-Khater. I just have a question about how seriously we can take media that's so controlled. Social media is supposed to be kind of this free place to say what you want, and this isn't just applicable to the Middle East, I want to say. Media is highly controlled by the state sometimes, but also they're beginning to be able to control social media. So I'm wondering how we're supposed to interpret that in terms of kind of going to certain Twitter accounts to get our news, or certain websites that, state-controlled news outlets for our information. You'd like to speak on that?
So, if I'm getting your question right, you're asking about ways to use social media in a manner that is truly free, right?
Yes.
Is this essentially the question?
Yes.
This is a dilemma. Right? I'm afraid that there isn't one right answer, but what I know for sure is the answer, or the beginning of that, is about awareness. If you don't know that a problem exists, you cannot address it. So the first thing is to raise awareness about this, to make people conscious about their decisions, and it's a process. It's not it's a process. It'll take a long time. Exposing some of the practices is very important, I would say. And this can only happen if we, collectively work together to do so. But as I told you, there isn't one right answer. Social media is just like any other human invention throughout history. It's been used in good ways and bad ways.
Thank you.
John Duke Anthony, the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. How would you validate or assess the following? My mind is exploding having seen how you come at the question of information and rational thought. How legitimate is the following? That information is so central, so vital, so crucial to insight. It improves or provides insight. But those two are inadequate, but they are the roads to knowledge. And knowledge is not the same thing as understanding, but it's linked to it. And three roads to understanding are empathy, empirical experience, and education, all of which are occurring here. And these four steps, with information being the foundation stone, are the roads to improved rational thinking and capacity for critical analysis, and tiptoeing towards the ultimate goal of wisdom, which is elusive. The information part is, to me, the foundation for the other three. How valid do you, how do you assess or evaluate that linkage, those linkages?
Once again, that's a very complex question, I should say, but I totally agree that the foundation of any knowledge, any understanding that we can build starts with the information that we can perceive. The problem with the age we're living in is not lack of information, as I said. It's just excessive information that is hugely unchecked. And this is creating many dilemmas. 2016, Oxford Dictionary. I mean, every year they choose a term, right? And the term in 2016 was post-truth. Now, there is a reason behind this, right? The link is there. Are we able to reverse the effect? This is a question. Technology is advancing. Those programmers, scientists, in their labs, they're not asking the big questions because they've been programmed not to ask the big questions. They just advance things here and there, and it's been a while, sir. I mean, since we started asking the big questions, it's not fashionable anymore, right? Ever since we separated philosophy from empirical sciences, I think we've been suffering in a way. And that's why maybe the starting point is to kind of challenge the status quo and start asking some of these tough questions, asking these scientists to kind of, you know, just look up, look at the world, look at what's happening. The other day we were having a discussion about American economy, and I never realized that automation is a serious question here. I never realized this, to be honest. But it seems like companies are going that way, that path. But how is this going to impact the people? Once again, no one's asking. It's a very complicated relationship, and I totally agree with your assessment.
Thank you.
I have a list, and I have Yumna, and then Patrick, and then Greg, and then please. So let's take 4 questions, and then is that okay? Okay.
Hi, my name is Yumna. I'm a student here at the Islamic Studies. My question is, how do you see the response to the freedom of expression that we have right now in the media scene that has also helped the spread of hate speech and perhaps even material that people do not wish to share or wish to see, especially concerning also what happened in New Zealand and the video. So how do you think we should perceive or respond to these changes in the sphere of the social media and its effects on people?
Thank you.
Patrick Ferris, I first I want to congratulate you on an amazing lecture. I spent 60 years as a diplomat in and out of the Arab world, and I never expected to hear an official of an Arab government ever deliver that sort of lecture, and that's a compliment. But my question is, you defined the public space that might have been. In a couple of sentences, could you define the public space as it is now in the Arab world?
Hi, Greg Noth, also a student here at the center. My question was very related about the public space that would have been. I was wondering, what do you consider responsible for preventing the emergence of that public space, and why do we only look at the first 12 to 18 months of the uprisings before we think about how that public space changed?
Just to answer these. Sure. So just to start with the limiting question, freedom of expression and hate speech. The problem is people make it seem like as if it's a trade-off, right? Or in a way. So it's either that you have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and then with that comes hate speech, etc. Or you shut that down, hoping that you would shut down hate speech. And reality is, most closed societies have things like xenophobia and many other phenomena that are equivalent of hate speech. I think there are many intermediary factors in between that we need, it's our responsibility collectively to highlight. One of which is reason. Reason. I mean, let us reason things. Another thing is fact-checking. Is what you, for example, if, let's say, I'm a radical Muslim, right? And I make a generalization about, I don't know, white people, right? I mean, if we have the right conditions in place, right? I should be challenged by the question, can you prove this empirically, right? Can you give me the facts? Give me, we need to reason it throughout. And if we do that, if we have the right conditions and the right environment to do that, to engage, I think that automatically, the vast majority of the society would fall into just the normal, standard, good citizen kind of category. And you'll always have that percentage. It's not, it's like side damage that we can tolerate, I think, to an extent. But let's not make it a trade-off. At least this is my opinion. I'm not sure if this addresses your question, does it? And Ambassador Theros, and thanks so much for your question. This is a very, very difficult question. To describe the public sphere as it is now. We are going back to the moments of the 50s and the 60s. I know that many people look at that period in the Arab region with a lot of passion. They kind of glorify that, etc. There were many great things about that period, but the not so great thing about that period is the confiscation of the public sphere. Before that, just to give you one example, in Egypt, you're talking early 20th century, you had over 100 Arabic publications in Egypt only, and over 60 publications in English. Post, 1952 revolution, it brought many good things, no question about that, including social equality and other things. But one of the not so good things that it did is the fact that we went from 100 plus to 3 newspapers that would say the same thing. This is the confiscation of the public sphere. There was no public debate, not in universities, not in journalism, not in... So what we have today is the confiscation of the public sphere and the fragmentation of it. And there is the recreation of one space that would have governments, elitists, not necessarily in the positive sense, but those who are close to the government, etc. And the rest are pushed once again to the margins, once again to the underground. And that's why I don't think that this is a stable situation. Simply because social media created other virtual spaces. And these people are getting together in these virtual spaces. And you know what the danger is? The danger is the following. in those spaces, they're all the same. Same logic, same thinking, same rhetoric. No one is challenging. And they're very comfortable. But then, once this opens up and you start challenging, this is when a real discussion and a real change happens. That's why I'm so worried about the current situation and how we in public sphere, if it exists altogether, how it looks like today. So that's one thing. Greg, there was a question there about who's responsible or what is it that happened after like 18 months. In Arabic literature now they talk about counter-revolutions, right? And once again, going to that period of the 50s and the 60s, this is essentially the reproduction of it. An attempt to reproduce some sort of, unfortunately, totalitarianism in the region. And what happened is exactly that. I mean, there was polarization. And unfortunately, in the Arab region, we could not apparently tolerate for a long time the fact that we can have differences. One of an Egyptian thinker, writer called Amr Hamzawi, Dr. Amr Hamzawi, wrote an article in retrospect after a few years. He participated in the January Revolution. He said he's a liberal himself. You know what he said? He said, after years of activism, I consider myself a liberal, trying to create a liberal base in the Arab region. Now I can say, and I'm quoting Amr Hamzawi, now I can say that we almost don't have Arab liberals in the Arab region because Arab liberals couldn't tolerate the multiplicity of opinions. So this is what happened. This answer.
I want to take one last question from Imam Hindi.
Imam Yahya Hindi, Muslim chaplain here. To start with, I am so proud of Qatar because it empowers its women, and I hope it's become the case in every Arab and Muslim country, that women are in the lead teaching us, as they have always been, the backbone of our culture and ummah and community. So I'm so proud of you and amazing lecture, honestly. My question is on, you use the word rules and regulations when it comes to social media. I say, yes, we need rules and regulations. We watched the live streaming of the terrorist attack on the New Zealand 2 mosques. I don't want that. On the other hand, I say, no, I want it. If I prevent him or her or likewise from presenting themselves, that would be used as an excuse to prevent others from presenting themselves. Watching APAC conference in the last 2 days, my God, if you speak about BDS, you're going to be called anti-Semite, you are anti-civilized nations, you cannot speak anymore. It's dangerous. You know, so how do we talk about regulations? Do we need to talk really about regulations in this context, that if you prevent one, you prevent the others? Why don't all people have the freedom and teach them how to be morally, ethically responsible in the material they represent?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more about the need to educate people, create some sort of moral standards rather than rules and regulations, of course. Rules and regulations, though, will still be needed for certain things like cyber crimes, for example, hacking, fabricating things. You still need to regulate that, because when you fabricate, let's say, a statement or news or whatever, this is not subject to, you know, whether one agrees or disagrees with someone else. It's a matter of, you know, making something up, which is completely illegal, right? So that's why we need some rules and regulations within certain limits, I would say, and then we should rely more and more on absolutely moral standards. Honestly, I think religious scholars and others, and from all faiths and religions, have a huge responsibility when it comes to that. And here, we cannot, I mean, dismiss the New Zealand example and the example that they have set for all of us, the leadership in New Zealand gives us hope, true hope, the way they handled it, the level of responsibility. This is exactly a model that gives us, all of us, I think, some hope, and hopefully other leaders would follow the example of New Zealand and its Prime Minister.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for this lecture. And I think I'm about ready to walk into the classroom and with 30 of our students and and the subject of the day is revolutions. And so it's quite apropos, no? But also to really think about how you are engaging with the theoretical work of Habermas in the public sphere, and how we as societies are really struggling with both how to have a space in which to express ourselves, and yet kind of how do we deal with the harm that comes from those sorts of things. And so your presentation and the questions that the audience has asked and the answers that you've put forward, I think really really cast important light and help us think through those things. So we're really grateful for you being here today. So thank you very much.